Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We're honored to have with us Pastor Joel Richardson. He's a New York Times bestselling author, internationally recognized teacher. He lives in the U.S. with his wife and 5 children. He's written a number of bestselling books, including one that has just come out, When a Jew Rules the World, with the Global Jesus Revolution out this month, talking about Israel, Islam, and the gospel at the end of the age. Has also written End Times Eyewitness, Mideast Beast, Islamic Antichrist, God's War on Terror, and Why We Left Islam. Joel also has a website, Joel's Trumpet. Welcome to the Joe Miller Show, Pastor Joel Richardson.
Joe, thanks for having me on.
So it's interesting. We think about the Mideast and we think about ISIS and the conflict that's going on there, the persecution of minority Christian groups. We hear about Iraq and the fact that the ancient Christian population of well over 1 million, mostly gone. You hear about what's going on in Egypt with the Coptic Christians and the persecution that they're undergoing. What you are talking about in this book that just came out, The Global Jesus Revolution, I have not had opportunity to read it yet, but apparently you're describing the counterintuitive, that there's actually been an explosion of Christian activity in some of these areas where persecution is worse. Can you tell our audience a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, yeah, in fact, when we look at not just in the Middle East, but really throughout the Islamic world, we see that despite persecution, Muslims are converting to Christianity. The church is actually growing among Muslim communities throughout the earth, unlike any time in history. And so while there's no question that, in some areas, of course, in Syria and Iraq, where the Islamic State is established, Christianity is almost wiped out, pushed out of those areas. But really just to the peripheral of the Islamic State, we were in Iraqi Kurdistan, northern Iraq, just in January, in the city of Erbil, and then up north, heading up toward Iran and Turkey. You've got, right now, a few million refugees, displaced peoples, and many of the Christians that have fled there, there's actually revivals breaking out in some of the refugee camps. We've got Muslims and even, nominal cultural Christians that are recommitting their lives to Jesus, as well as even among some of the Yazidis, which are a minority group there that were persecuted by the Islamic State. So, despite all of the bad news that we see every day, despite what Satan is doing, the Lord is doing something powerful as well. And so whenever Satan comes in like a flood, the Lord raises up a standard.
So are these revivals spontaneous, or are there people coming in to try to engage with Christians and help them renew their faith?
Well, there's a combination of things. Of course, you've got tens of thousands of Christians that are recognizing the opportunity of the refugee crisis, that are coming in with all sorts of humanitarian aid. We came in with ourselves, just several friends with over $10,000 worth of medicines, a medical doctor, and so doing those sort of things. And then you have some of the local Christians that actually speak the language, that are witnessing to the people, and you have the work of missionaries. So really, it's all of the above combined. But in the midst of it, there's also some supernatural things. One of the more common testimonies that we hear from Muslims that are coming to faith are that Jesus appeared to them in a dream or a vision. And so there's a lot of supernatural kind of stuff mixed in there. But even when those things take place, someone will come along, a missionary or a local Christian, that will be there with the Bible, to answer questions and that sort of thing. And it's really, I would say, the heart of what the Lord is doing. I mean, it's amazing to think that here in the United States, this so-called Christian nation, we're turning away from faith so quickly. And in nations like Iran, the most unlikely of nations, we actually have the fastest growing church in the world. And at present growth rates, right now, the church in Iran is growing at just under 20% per year. At these rates, within about 20 years, Iran would be half Christian. Now, I don't know that we're going to see growth that, consistent, but again, this is unheard of in history.
So are the revivals in Iran, are they public, or are these just house churches that are kind of staying under the radar of the authorities where this type of growth is happening?
Entirely under the radar. After Ahmadinejad came in, the government is very threatened. we need to understand in Iran, you have an incredibly young country. The majority of them want nothing to do with Islam. They are completely turned off to Islam. The mosques are empty. They're very favorable to the West. The radicals are the government and, some from the rural areas that they bust in. Majority are very hungry. They're sick of Islam, and in that vacuum, they're very hungry. So these things take place under the radar. If they get caught, they will be tortured. They'll be put in prison and, raped. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. It's brutal, but despite all of that, they are risking everything because, as I said, the Lord is moving. He's showing up and doing miracles, and some of the stories that are coming out of Iran are just absolutely amazing.
We put up on restoringliberty.com a couple of stories that have come out of the Islamic State. Radicals, in fact, one guy that was responsible himself for murdering untold numbers of Christians who had an appearance of Christ in a dream, and that led to his conversion, radical conversion. So it's exciting to see that. Now, do you see that these changes, the growth of Christianity in some of the most hard persecuted areas under Islamic control, do you see this as a sign of the times? Do you attribute some prophetic significance to these developments?
Well, to a degree, this isn't to say, I want to be clear, we're not going to see Islam go away. What's happening is amazing, it's wonderful, but we're not seeing the numbers that, Islam is no longer a threat. Islam is here for the long haul. This is the great challenge of our day. This is the Goliath of our day, and I believe it will be around until Jesus returns. Despite that, in terms of signs of the times, you have the oracle of Isaiah 19. And this is one of the most important Old Testament prophecies because it speaks of a great revival, specifically in Egypt and Assyria in the last days before the return of Jesus. And when you say, well, what's Assyria? Ancient Assyria is basically the Islamic State as well as what we would call Kurdistan, northern Iraq, as well as portions of Iran and eastern Turkey. So here you have this promise of this revival throughout that whole region. And yet the Islamic State sweeps in. So, a friend of mine, I'll just say, is an underground pastor in Iran. And he always says that Ayatollah Khomeini was really one of the greatest evangelists for our time because he showed the people the true face of Islam. And as a result of that, they've turned off to Islam. Well, I believe in a few years we're going to look back and say ISIS was one of the greatest things that happened for the growth and the explosion of the church because even Muslims, they're looking at this and they're saying, this is disgusting, and yet this is exactly what Muhammad and his immediate followers did. What ISIS has done throughout the region is almost a perfect mirror image of the early Islamic conquests, and people are looking at that, and the human spirit is saying, I want nothing to do with this, and I think in the long haul, it's going to produce a great number of Christians throughout the region.
We only have a minute left in this segment, but you see the growth of Islam, or not necessarily the growth, but the perpetuation of Islam to give actually birth to a global leader. In one of your books entitled The Islamic Antichrist, do you assume that this figure is going to come out of the Islamic State Caliphate that they're trying to establish now?
No, I don't. In fact, I think the Islamic State's going to get wiped out. I think we're going to see some major regional wars, but when you look at the testimony of the biblical prophets, they name names, they name regions, they name tribes, peoples, and in speaking of the armies that will follow the Antichrist, and every single time they are peoples, regions that are in the Middle East, Muslim-majority nations in North Africa, every single reference. So I think it's pretty clear that this is the region the Antichrist will be coming from, but I don't think it's going to come specifically from the Islamic State.
We have Joel Richardson with us, New York Times best-selling author, internationally recognized teacher. He'll stay with us in this next segment. Back after this. Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We have Pastor Joel Richardson on with us. He's a New York Times best-selling author, written a number of books, many of which I'm sure you've heard about. End Times Eyewitness, The Global Jesus Revolution, just out. When a Jew Rules the World, Mideast Beast, Islamic Antichrist, God's War on Terror, Why We Left Islam, Joel's Trumpet, his website. Been featured on numerous radio, TV, and news outlets across the world. It was on Glenn Beck just a few weeks ago, the Mike Huckabee Show, Gordon Liddy Show, etc. So now on the Joe Miller Show. Pastor Richardson, thank you for being with us for another segment.
Joe, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So one of the things that kind of piqued my interest in the last segment, you said that you believe ISIS is going to be wiped out. Tell our audience how you think that's going to happen.
Sure. Now, I don't know that they're necessarily going to completely dry up, but I think the Islamic State is going to be replaced. When we look at the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8, it actually speaks of Persia, this Persian ram, breaking out across the Middle East and really conquering the whole region. It says that no one will be able to stand up against Iran. And it's interesting that when you really look at the plan that the Iranian regime has laid out since the revolution, 79, they've really accomplished everything that they said they would accomplish. The only thing they haven't achieved at this point is nuclear weapons, and of course that's just within reach at this point. Thank you, Thank you to the Obama regime.
Right.
But essentially, right now we have ISIS. We need to understand that ISIS, they are Sunni and Iran Shia. And so you have ISIS that are encroaching upon some of the Iranian, the Shia sacred cities in Iraq. Iran has committed itself to defending Assad in Syria. And so in many, many ways, this is deeply disturbing what to the Iranians, what ISIS is doing. And I really think it's going to be the bait that pulls Iran out. When you look at Daniel 8, you have the angel Gabriel actually tells Daniel, he says, listen, this vision, it concerns the end times. I mean, he makes it very clear. He actually states 3 times in 2 sentences that it concerns the end times. So you have Iran breaks out across the region and conquers the whole region. And then essentially, most translations say Greece, but the word there is actually Yavan. In ancient times, Yavan included all of Western Turkey as well as the Aegean region there, the Balkans. And it says that Yavan will respond and crush Persia at that point. And so I think that, if this is in fact an end-time prophecy, and again, the words of the angel Gabriel are pretty clear, then I think we're going to see an Iranian war. I think ISIS will be crushed. Of course, ISIS is metastasizing all over the world, so I don't think that it's going to go away everywhere. But I do think the Islamic State will be crushed by Iran, which will then in turn be crushed by Turkey. And as a result, we'll just see a complete rewriting of the whole landscape of the Middle East, which of course is already well underway. But, this is going to have a dramatic impact, not just on the region, but on the world.
I want to talk a little bit more about Turkey and what you perceive for it in the future as far as growth of power goes. But just to turn back to Iran for a minute, mentioning biblical prophecy, suggesting the expansion of the growth of power of Iran, do you think the Israeli leadership is looking at Scripture and guiding its foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran in any way based upon what they believe Scripture predicts regarding Iran, Persia?
I would tend to say no. It's amazing. You have in Israel, you have what's called the nascent Sanhedrin, sort of the revived version of this ancient body of rabbinic scholars, 70 rabbinic leading rabbis in Israel. Just last year, I sat down with the foreign minister to the nascent Sanhedrin, and I was really shocked in that, as I asked him about various prophecies, within the Jewish scriptures, within the Hebrew scriptures, there was really just sort of a we don't really pay attention to that. Not much different than what we would find in a lot of the mainstream churches here. And he would quote Maimonides and say, well, even the prophets, they didn't even know what they were talking about, and it was just a real disregard. And within even rabbinic Judaism, they tend to focus on the Talmud and not the actual scriptures themselves. So perhaps they're looking at some of these things, but I think by and large, the Israeli government, they're looking at self-defense. They're looking at, protecting their existence. And, they see a regime which is openly calling for wiping Israel off the map. And so I think they have every right to respond at the appropriate time, and they very well may. But, in terms of existential threats, they're multiplying all over the region. So it's not just Iran, it's also ISIS and the radical Shia bloc as well as the radical Sunni bloc. And so it really is, they're caught between a rock and a hard place. You've got the lesser of two evils, and so that if you take one out, you're going to empower the other one. This is the conundrum of the Middle East.
Now, looking at Turkey and its role in the future, obviously you see an expanded role from where it's at today. What becomes Turkey in your perspective of what happens in the future?
Sure. Well, first we need to understand that, over the past 12 years with the AKP party in Turkey under President Erdogan, Turkey has experienced an Islamic revolution, not much unlike what Iran experienced. The difference, of course, is that the Iranian leaders thumb their nose at the United States and call, death to America, death to the great Satan. And so they've had to live under sanctions for the past, decade, for the past generation, really. Whereas Turkey, they use all the language of inclusiveness and interfaith dialogue and all of these things. And so when President Erdogan comes to the White House, he gets a big hug. But their goals are the same. They both want to control the region. Yet we need to understand, Islamism in Turkey is incredibly dangerous, but nationalism in Turkey is absolutely off the charts in a way that most Americans can't even comprehend. The Turks fully believe that they are destined to dominate the region, even as they did under the Ottoman Empire for 500 years. I actually went to a pro-government Erdogan rally there in some of the outskirts of Istanbul. It was probably 1 million people. And I tell you, Joe, it felt like I was standing in Zeppelin Tribune Field. It felt like a redo of Nazi Germany. And it was the exaltation of one man, one leader that has turned their economy around and is going to thrust the Turkish people forward onto the world stage and bring them back to the glory days of the Ottoman Empire. It was hard to describe. I mean, the level of nationalism. Most Americans can't even begin to understand that. And so, the scriptures are clear. Ezekiel 38:39, often referred to as the battle of Gog-Magog, it says that the Antichrist is going to be a leader. In this passage, it calls him Gog. It says he's going to be a leader from Magog, and he's the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now, if you look at a lot of the popular prophecy books, they'll try to say this is talking about Russia and this sort of thing. But if you simply look at the evangelical Bible atlases, the IVP Bible Atlas, Zondervan Atlas of the Bible, Holman Bible Atlas, they're all going to say that Magog, Meshech, Tubal is ancient Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. So the scriptures are pretty clear that this is the region the Antichrist comes out of. I don't think it's President Erdogan. I think it's someone else yet to come. Again, we're going to see some wars in the region. But we need to realize this is the largest army in the Middle East, second largest military in NATO, and the combination of nationalism, regional, imperial aspirations and Islamism, and just with all of the flux in the Middle East, Turkey is really the nation to watch.
So what's going on between Turkey and Israel now? Of course, there's been some fraying of ties, particularly after the boat incident that occurred last year or the year before. Has there been any attempt to reestablish any of the military ties that Turkey and Israel had several years ago? Or are things still pretty sideways between the two nations?
Yeah, completely sideways. I mean, of course, occasionally you have some cooler heads that speak out and talk about repairing relations there. But when you have a leader like Erdogan and Prime Minister Davutoglu, these guys, they're just like your typical Arab leader. Whenever the elections roll around, they start throwing out the anti-Israel rhetoric, really just sort of the over-the-top conspiratorial, inflammatory, anti-Semitic statements, saying, the Zionist, the global Zionist lobby is trying to, break in and destroy our election system and this sort of thing. And really inflame, and the level of anti-Israel sentiment in Turkey is through the roof.
Right.
If you just do polls now, that the whole in terms of Turkey, that whole southwestern coastline, they're much more secular there, but much of the country in the rural areas have really turned much more Islamic in recent years, and so the sentiment there is actually worse against Israel than it is in much of the Arab world, which is really shocking in light of the fact that this is the nation that we still are treating as though this is the model that we want to replicate throughout the Middle East. And, this great model of moderate secular Islamism is gone. It doesn't exist anymore.
Well, part of it is because there's such a concern about Islamic radicalism, and they see a nationalistic government as far safer. But like you noted, especially when you've got the history behind Turkey and the need to reestablish what the empire, the Ottoman Empire, that could have far greater impact. Now, to effectuate that strong military, you mentioned how large the military in Turkey is. At one point, of course, NATO had nuclear weapons in Turkey itself. You know anything about whether or not there's an effort to develop nuclear capacity in Turkey? Is there any news on that at all?
I haven't heard. I haven't seen anything about that. Of course, now that it's not going to be long before Iran will have nuclear weapons. So the Saudis, of course, are saying, well, we need to get nuclear weapons, and then, pointing out, well, Israel has them, and if they have them, we should. And so it's really just a matter of time before every major government in the Middle East is going to say, well, we have to have them as well. But specifically with Turkey, no, I haven't seen that. Of course, Turkey really is the espionage capital of the world. So, who knows what's going on behind the scenes, but I haven't heard anything publicly.
Yeah, the whole nuclear thing, it's a frightening thing. Of course, some would suggest that Saudi Arabia may actually already have nukes. They certainly funded the Pakistani program. Some believe that there could have been. It would have been difficult for them to have done this outside of the American clandestine agencies knowing it, but transfer of weapons to Saudi Arabia. But, yeah, it's a catastrophe waiting to happen. What's next in the Middle East?
Well, again, we have in the midst of it all, we have the revival that's going on, but I do think the next major event will be the breakout of Iran. Right now they're functioning throughout the region through their proxies, right? They've got Hezbollah in Lebanon and fighting in Syria for Assad. They've got now their Houthis, the Houthi rebels there, in Yemen, right on the border of Saudi Arabia. They've got their people in Iraq, and really the government of Iraq is pretty much a proxy of Iran at this point. But beyond the proxy war, I think we will see a full-blown military invasion of the Middle East in an effort. It'll all be said to be an effort to wipe out ISIS by Iran. And, this could be something that we could see in as little as the next year. It could be a few years, but I think the next major event will be an Iranian regional war. And as I said, the response after that, of course, will be from Turkey, because Turkey, they're not going to tolerate that in their backyard. And these events are going to completely change the whole world. There's a saying in Turkey: if you show the people death, they will happily embrace malaria. And so essentially what Turkey's going to do is they're going to say, look, you've seen ISIS, everyone's sick of it. We are the entity that the people want a caliphate, they want Islamic law, but let us, we're far more cultured, let us step forward and be the leaders of this Islamic caliphate. And I think we will see some form of a pan-Islamic government setup in Turkey. We'll say we're the ones to do it.
Pastor Joel Richardson, New York Times bestselling author, written a number of great books. Get them at Amazon.com. Appreciate your insights on what's going on in the Middle East. We'd love to have you back at some point in the future. Thanks again for being on the Joe Miller Show.
Anytime. Thanks so much, Joe.